Hello and welcome to the Economic Times India Budget Summit. I am Richa Sharma and today we are into the Climate Action Edition. Here we will be discussing about the budget and the India's net zero transition. The year started on a positive note with the Union government announcing the green hydrogen mission with an allocation of 19,500 crore to incentivize development of technology and resources, which are going to play a key role in low carbon transition for hard to abate sector like steel and cement. Moreover, India has set an ambitious goal of having 50% of installed capacity from non-fossil fuels by 2030 and reducing emission intensity of its GDP by 45%. What kind of resources and policy interventions are required for these transitions, and how this year's budget can play a role in setting a roadmap amid turbulent global economic conditions?
So hello and welcome to the Economic Times Rising Bharat Summit. My name is Prashant Mukherjee and today we have a person who doesn't need any formal introduction. He's an eminent scientist and a man who has been the architect for India's transition towards clean energy, Dr. VK Saraswat. A very warm welcome to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Very good morning.
Very good morning, sir.
And I'm very happy to be participating in this Economic Times Rising Bharat Summit on energy transition. At the onset, let me wish all the participants a very happy New Year 2023. And with this conference and panel discussion, I think it's an apt beginning as far as the energy transition requirements of the country are concerned. I'm going to talk to you about net zero. How do we achieve that particular mission which has been set to us? You will appreciate that human civilization is experiencing a non-linear growth in energy demand with the technological advancement and rising demand in every sector. Sustainability question for a nation remains balanced in three key aspects, namely society, economy, and environment.
Right.
The global problem statement that appears irrespective of nations is to ensure sustainable energy for humanity, to nurture the quality of life from all aspects known to the man.
Right.
The primary goal to achieve sustainable energy for all by 2030 will require the focus on three major ingredients: ensuring universal access to modern energy services, doubling the global rate of improvement in energy efficiency, doubling the share of alternative energy and technologies in the global energy mix scenario. With the resources steadily depleting, increased environmental impact, and unbalanced quality of life, the importance of pursuit towards net zero emissions and judicious energy utilization have become the unavoidable context in the global scenario. Now, I would like to address what is net zero. Net zero refers to a balance where emissions of the greenhouse gases are offset by the absorption of an equivalent amount from the atmosphere. Experts see net zero targets as critical measure to successfully tackle climate change and its devastating consequences. What are the pledges which have been taken by the top three emitters in the world? China, Beijing announced no new pledges on Monday. It previously pledged net zero by 2060. I'm quoting from COP26.
Right.
United States, the US touted domestic legislation to spend $555 billion to boost renewable power and electric vehicles. It has pledged net zero by 2050. And India, the country's economy will become carbon neutral by the year 2070. So what is the global scenario and what kind of pathways the world has decided to follow? With the present trends of post-industrial revolution, the rising greenhouse gas emission will reach a mark up to about 150 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent by the year 2100 if no climate policies are implemented. This will also exhibit a global average temperature rise of 4.1 degrees Celsius to 4.8 degrees Celsius, which will be detrimental to the global life cycle. However, the current climate policies show that by 2050, greenhouse gas emissions will peak above 50 gigatons, limiting the global temperature rise to about 2.5 degree to 2.9 degrees Celsius. Thus, there is an utmost need for implementing the 2 degrees Celsius and 1.5 degrees Celsius pathways to limit the greenhouse gas emissions peak by the year 2025 and reach net zero emissions goals by 2070. Under the 1.5 degrees centigrade scenario, the participation from different sectors leading to carbon dioxide emission abatement can be estimated to have profound impact on the global annual emission rate. Renewable energy, energy conservation, and efficiency measures are projected to have the maximum impact in reducing about 50% of the emission rate scenario, followed by the electrification agenda in the end use sectors by about 20%. Bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, what we call as BECCS, and separate CCUS programs in the industrial sectors cumulatively promise a 20% reduction for the same. Application and shifting to hydrogen and other derivatives also illustrate a 10% lowering of the emission scenario. We can thus forecast a decrease in global CO2 emissions rate by the year 2050, optimistically moderated by about 36.9 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. Let's look at what are the sectoral carbon dioxide emissions in India. India's power sector is the largest contributor to its carbon dioxide emissions. The coal-fired power plants are responsible for the great majority of power sector emissions. The cumulative CO2 emissions from the power was reported to be almost about 1,147 million tons by the year 2000, metric tons by the year 2019. And this is followed by the growing industrial sectors in India, like from iron, steel, cement, and many more. The transport sector is another major contributor of greenhouse gas emissions, which has a unique form of emission characteristics in the form of line emitters. The emission occurs in a distributed manner, unlike static emitters like power sector. So from the Indian scenario, it is a very important question now that how do we foresee the greenhouse gas emission trajectory for India and produce consequently towards net zero goals. Right. Focusing on the past scenario, it can be observed that by the 2018 annual CO2 emissions rate, cumulatively from all the sectors was about 2.3 gigatons per annum. And the forecasted emissions rate during the year 2030 illustrates a 76% increase, that is almost about 4 gigatons per annum from 2018 values, that is above that. This certainly calls for actively taking part in the global initiative towards net zero, but in a way sustainable from India's own perspective. Now, I would certainly like to mention here what our Honorable Prime Minister has promised during the COP26. Yeah. He said that India will reach the non-fossil energy capacity to about 500 gigawatts by 2030. India will meet 50% of its energy requirements from renewable by 2030. India will reduce the total projected carbon emissions by 1 billion tons from now onwards till 2030. By 2030, India will reduce the carbon intensity of its economy by less than 45%. And by 2070, India will achieve the target of net zero. If we have to really meet all these goals, what have been identified by our Honorable Prime Minister, I think we have to look at what is the total energy demand scenario in India. If you look at the demand profile, the country's energy demand has tripled over the last 3 decades and is marked by a falling share of traditional biomass, leaving coal and oil in a dominant position. Rising population and income since 2000 have underpinned a doubling of energy use in India. But per capita energy consumption still is less than 40% of the world average. However, if India's additional energy needs to reach respectable human development index are the highest in the world. According to NITI Aayog prediction, very recently, in 2047, India's electricity demand under the business as usual scenario is about 5,651 terawatt hours. And by the year 2070, it will touch almost 18,900 to 22,300 terawatt hours per year. That is a kind of simulation that has indicated with respect to the demand profile. With the projected energy demand of the growing population, coal will still play a dominant role, and its share in primary energy supply is projected to rise to 51% in 2030 and 52% in 2047. The energy supply is projected to be followed by gas, nuclear, and renewables in the ratio of 28%, 8%, and 8% respectively. The climate crisis is here, and India needs to make deep carbon emission cuts very quickly to ensure sustainable energy security and address the present crisis. Deployment of clean energy to achieve decarbonization as well as ensuring inclusive growth is one of the biggest challenges. Thus, the conventional ways of utilization of fossil fuel will see a complete paradigm shift aiming towards increased efficiency and cleaner approaches. So I would like to give you an overall profile of what is the strategy or what are the energy transition pathways suggested. One among them is the clean coal technologies, which will be unearthing the efficient utilization of indigenous coal reserves. Okay. The carbon capture utilization, that is CCUS, and storage will be mitigating the carbon emissions and the greenhouse under the greenhouse gas scenario. Hydrogen, that is the blue or green, will be enabling clean fuel opportunity for energy conversion with zero carbon emissions. Honorable Prime Minister has already announced the green hydrogen mission for the country. Methanol, ethanol, ammonia would be the alternative fuel for clean combustion in every sector. Small modular reactors, small modular reactor is referred to as nuclear small modular reactors, will be used for heat and power generation for captive and replacement sites, avoiding emissions and large-scale problems of what we call as the larger nuclear power plants. Mobility, vehicles, electrification, and charging alongside exploring hybrids, fuel cell, and alternative fuels. Renewable energy and storage systems where wind, solar, ocean, biomass, pumped storage systems, and lithium-ion batteries, sodium-ion batteries, flow batteries, technologies with indigenous approach will be the pathway for meeting the net carbon zero scenario. I just want to spend a little time on what will be the role of nuclear energy in this context. Small modular reactors are the key to a long-term energy strategy addressing issues on the energy generation mix, the energy demand, and the interconnects. The energy demand is usually in the form of a periodic cycle with seasonal and regional variations. At its simplest, the demand over the cycle can be split into a base load and peak load. Given the demand, the energy mix must be determined to maximize utility of the resources. Best energy mix strategy for India, especially in the net zero emission scenario, is to use renewables paired with steady carbon-free source like nuclear energy. It will facilitate access to nuclear energy in new sectors and or regions, namely off-grid or in remote locations. Adaptation to site constraints, seismic and cooling sources, newcomer access to the nuclear energy. Decarbonizing energy systems will be another one, that is replacing of aging coal power plants, non-electric applications like district heating and all with nuclear power plants. So energy emissions and net zero will certainly be our priority. To achieve this, we should talk about what kind of monies would be needed. To achieve net zero in 2070, installed power capacity of solar should increase to 5,630 gigawatts. Use of coal needs to be peaking around 2040 and go down by 99% between the years 2040 and 2070. And crude oil consumption should peak by 2050. The success of interventions will depend on the availability of finances. Center for Energy Finance estimates that for achieving net zero, India will need about $10 trillion. That means almost about 700 lakh crore. About $8.4 trillion will be to scale renewable energy generation and relevant infrastructure, and about 1.5 trillion for setting up green hydrogen production for industrial decarbonization. To conclude, I would say towards clean energy and net zero transition, we are walking on a tightrope, trying to balance energy security for its 1.4 billion population and contributing to global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Roadmap would be for a clean energy transition as follows: higher penetration of renewable energy, solar, wind, hydro, biomass, and so on. Setting up carbon capture, utilization, and storage to lower down the footprint. Utilizing captured carbon dioxide for green methanol production, ammonia production, and so on. Aggregate production of other value-added products like graphene, polyesters, and so on. Embrace emerging and clean energy resources like hydrogen, pumped storage systems. We also call them as water battery. Realizing small modular reactors, the nuclear technology. Digitalizing and AI-driven technologies to form the core of future-proof and efficient transmission system. Access to sustainable competitive capital to accelerate the energy transformation journey. In the end, I would say, as India is traversing its energy transition journey, its success story would be written in the annals of history and would serve as a source of inspiration for clean energy transition all over the world. Thank you. Namaskar.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saraswat, for those profound views. Well, when we talk about climate change, there are always two numbers which comes often. One is the 51 billion and another is zero. The 51 billion tons is the amount of carbon emissions or the greenhouse gases which world typically adds every year annually to the world. And zero is what everyone is trying to achieve. While achieving net zero emissions will not be simple or as easy, but certainly, as Dr. Saraswat explained, if we follow the rules and follow the plan, the goal is firmly within our reach. Thank you, Dr. Saraswat, for joining us today and for those beautiful remarks on our Rising Bharat Summit.
In this panel discussion, we have three distinguished panelists with whom we'll be discussing about what will be the roadmap for this journey. So let me warmly welcome all of three of panelists. We have Ms. Neha Kumar, India Program Head, Climate Bonds Initiative, Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, Fellow, Council on Energy, Environment and Water, and Mr. Manish Dabkara, CMD, AKI Energy Services India Limited and President, Carbon Market Association. To start with, we would request all three of our panelists to share their brief opening remarks on budget, putting a roadmap for green transition journey.
Yeah, thank you, Richa. I think this discussion is very, very timely. And also the central budget does, provide a window of opportunity if you really look at it from the green lens. So if you look at it from the perspective of the net zero transition that you talked about, but more immediately and pertinently, the 2030 targets that you talked about, then one would expect that the budget would lay out a direction which is more cogent, comprehensive, and systematic to actually move in that direction. Because 2030 targets and our long-term net zero target all will require a lot of investment in capital expenditure. The green framing is not only about, technological fixes that we will really require in our industrial sectors, but also that this green transition is also jobs rich, that the goods and services that it produces are affordable and accessible to larger set of consumers and communities will be an important part. And given that this will be the budget ahead of the election year, we would expect the budget to actually take into account not only on the green aspect of technology advancement, but also the job aspect, the sustainability aspect to be integrated within that green framing. And in my opening remarks, I would simply just put 4 points of sort of topics or action that we can further discuss. One is that how do we incentivize, given the large gap in financing that we have, how do we incentivize and recalibrate both public finance as well as augment private finance flows to be able to finance this transition. The second aspect is that now that our banking sector is has cleaner balance sheets, stronger balance sheets, and the NPA problem is more or less sort of resolved, then how do we actually expand credit? And I would again add another word, how we expand green credit to our industry, including to MSMEs, and whether it is only the PSL which needs to be repurposed, or we go beyond PSL, priority sector lending. The third aspect, I think, is that there will be demands on the fisc, right? There will be demands of income support, of much more spending to be done by the state as we move into this transition. So, and as well as, as we start moving away from carbon intensive, fossil dependent economy to more green economy, there would be loss of revenues in some sector. There would be, so that will have to be balanced out. So there will be perhaps a rationalization subsidies that will be required in a systematic manner. So all of that will require deft fiscal management. And the key thing over here would be, and I think it's something that the lens that we can say is that when we talk about green economy, the main feature of green finance is that what you spend on becomes transparent. So I think the time has come for the budget to bring those policies into actions, those incentives into action, that where the money goes is transparent and what the money is spent on is transparent. The fourth point that I wanted to make before we get into the discussion is the role of the national development banks like NABFID, and not only that, but the other DFIs like NABARD, like Exim Bank, like SIDBI, that will become very important, not only at the central level as well as the state level, because they're closer to the ground. They can price the risks in, they can actually use their capitalized balance sheet to crowd in private investment. All of that will become important, and we hope that the budget will, shed more light on how these things are going to shape up in the coming year.
Yeah, wonderful. So for the opening remarks, we now go to Dr. Chaturvedi. So we can briefly explain about what are your expectations, from the upcoming budget.
Great, thank you, Richa, for inviting me here. So the first point I want to emphasize is that the decarbonization discussion that we're having is essentially a discussion on economic transformation, and that's very important for emphasize, because many times it is viewed as like a environmentalist kind of discussion, a very specific environmental kind of discussion. It is not really that. It is actually a debate on economic transformation. That I think the way we start viewing this as a debate on economic transformation, our approach would be very different, and that is why the budget becomes absolutely critical, in this process. What the budget could kind of think about, the first thing it has to think about is what are the strategic technologies we could support, right? So technologies or green technologies or low carbon technologies could be in different phases of their life cycle, so to speak, right? Some could be at early stage, but there's very strategic, right? So the kind of intervention support that is needed is very different kind of support that is needed. The second is where we have made great progress. So the question is now not really about directional change. Directional change has already happened. The question is about speed and scale, right? So these two are very different kinds of technology, right? So in the first one, clearly we have hydrogen, right? Right now the costs are very high, right? So it is not that the change of direction has happened. And also to just inform the viewers, the hydrogen debate is actually not a new debate. There is already a couple of times the hydrogen debate has happened in the last 30 years. So the most recent one was in early 2000s when there was a lot of euphoria around hydrogen. And everybody thought that hydrogen will become cheaper and very cost effective and it will change the world. Nothing like that happened, right? So of course, this is now in the last 15 years, we've had great progress world over in terms of basic research on hydrogen. So we are much better placed, undoubtedly, right? But still we are very far, right? Now that is a strategic technology. Why strategic? Because it has a great potential for changing India's position as a global energy importer to a global energy exporter. And that's sort of a phenomenally different position to have in the first place, right? We have always imported oil and gas. Now that there is and we had no play in the oil and gas market, right? Because the cost of extraction is very high for us compared to, let's say, Middle East region, right? And we had no play in that market. In the hydrogen market, we have a very reasonable play. So even if, let's say, India is able to corner 10% of the global hydrogen export market, it's a tremendous foreign exchange earning for us, right? So that's why I'm calling this this sort of a strategic technology to invest in. So even though the cost is very high as of now, this is definitely a direction in which consistently we should be investing, just because the potential returns are very high for us as a country, right? So now that is one bucket of technology. Within this bucket, you could also say, I think we also have carbon capture and storage. If that is another technology which is nowhere on the horizon, but could end up being very strategic for us. The second bucket is, as I said, where great progress has happened, but now we are looking for speed and scale. And the technologies the first thing is clearly passenger electric vehicles. Already great progress is happening there in the private market, but people are not. So even if the capital cost parity is achieved, let's say electric car is equal in terms of capital cost to the petrol car, right? But just because of these questions around lack of charging stations, and lack of dependence on battery, there's some uncertainty around those kinds of things. People are not going to buy, right? So a lot of investment has to happen on those sort of the supporting ecosystem for EVs to really take off, right? And the second is also, I think a lot of focus is already being into renewable energy, right? Renewable energy has already achieved speed also, but it is the battery part or the storage part of the RE game where investment need to happen. And that is what the budget should look at. The third, then the final point I want to make is a very important sector. It's about public transportation, and especially the bus segment, right? And there is a great progress happening, and the CESL, which is I think the Government of India Enterprise, right? Convergence Energy Services Limited, that is doing the tendering process for the buses. We have already talked about 50,000 buses, electric buses, to be supported through this program. And that's a great initiative, right? Because just by demand aggregation, you are able to force the prices to be down at such an affordable level. And budget should definitely focus on just achieving much faster speed and scale in the bus segment, because I would think the budget should support that segment in a big way. Thank you.
Now coming on to Mr. Dabkara, there have been talks about what carbon market can play a crucial role. So what do you think? What do you expect out of the budget with respect to that?
So as you know, around 52 to 58 billion tons of CO2 emissions used to get emitted from the atmosphere, and with the help of NDCs, National Determined Contribution documents, it is being anticipated that around 60-70% targets we would be able to meet through those documents. And a very good step had been taken by Government of India to implement a domestic emission trading scheme through amendment of Energy Conservation Act 22, and probably by the mid of this calendar year 23 we would be getting a full scheme operationalized with the first phase of its trading aspects. So high anticipation or high expectations are there from the emitters who will be obligated under this domestic emission trading scheme or India carbon markets, because they would be getting some cap, for example, to by that specific cap, they would not be allowed to do the emissions, and to reduce their emissions because they would be looking to increase the emissions by increasing their production capacity, or because the high demand would be there in the market at the national level or in the international level. So definitely the emissions would be very, very tough to get reduced under the present situation. And to reduce the emissions, the emitters would require incentives, or in the form of, say, product linked incentives, or maybe in the form of taxation. For example, if someone is looking to buy any energy efficient equipment, so whatever the taxes that had been applied over all those equipments, for example, energy efficient boilers or furnaces or renewable energy projects, so the taxes should be the tax incentives should be given, or maybe subsidies should be given to all those emission reduction technologies, allowing the international carbon market, or linkages with the international carbon market is going to play a very important role, either maybe through Article 6.2 or of the Paris Agreement, or maybe through Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement, or maybe allowing international voluntary carbon markets. That is, so these three different mechanisms definitely will reduce some pressure, and then further tax and other incentives will give some relief to the big emitters, and then after MSMEs are going to get high impact because of all these taxations, or maybe domestic emission trading scheme implication would be very, very much critical. So as we know, European Union is going to impose cross-border adjustment mechanism, and that is definitely going to impact over the production capacity, or the competitiveness of the manufacturing organizations based in India. So our expectation is definitely to focus on how to take maximum leverage from the carbon markets, specifically the new domestic carbon market that is going to get implemented in India, its integration with the international carbon markets, and further tax and incentives to balance whatever the deficits would be there.
We know that there is a big gap in the climate finance, what India requires and what we have right now. And, the RBI recently has also kind of auctioned the sovereign green bonds. There's been a demand for tax stops, for the people investing in it, but the government has kind of, has said no to it. So how do you think that this is going to play up, when finally they are being auctioned?
What we have seen globally is that when a sovereign issues a green bond, and green bond has has very important features, which is that the use of proceeds is earmarked to the project. So the transparency aspect of it is the most important point for those who are investing in green bonds, and even the issuers who are raising the money. Now the auction that we are seeing right now, first of all, it is it is $2 billion worth, And from what we understand is that the government of India, it's great in itself that, everybody's looking at India's first debut sovereign green bond issuance. But also the government of India seems to be testing the appetite of the market. Okay, it is not issuing in international hard currency, and I think that's the right way to go. The local currency issuances by other green sovereign issuers have also had remarkable success. The success actually depends, Richa, on how neat the issuance is. So, that the green bond framework has been released by the Ministry of Finance, and it has also been, being given an opinion on by a second party opinion giver. And we have a light to medium green shading on that, which means that a lot of the projects and expenditures lie in a sort of not strict metrics and criteria so if the government is able to come out in this tranche, in these two tranches, with those projects and expenditures, which can be backed by clear metrics, clear criteria, so that the investor confidence is generated. And by which I mean that, okay, this is there are also retail investors. It is mainly and largely a domestic driven bond issuance, but it can set a benchmark in terms of the high level of integrity, high level of clarity in terms of where the use of proceeds will be deployed. And that is an important thing to do in creation of the local green bond market. The diversification of investor base is one of those motivation factors that all, green bond issuers take into account, whether they are sovereign green bond issuers or corporate green bond issuers. In India's case, what we expect is that the international investors domiciled in India are also, sort of looked at for investment for investing into this green bond. And they would be after a very clear sort of use of proceeds mechanism. And to this extent, I think we will see what our experience is. But the 2 billion amount is not a massive amount. And I think it is okay as a first step to test the appetite, to boost the local currency issuance, to get even the local retail investor and even small investors to actually look into green investment. We definitely hope that in the future issuances, not only the amount should increase, but their clear criteria will be set, and those will evolve hopefully through the taxonomy or even the international standards that the Indian government might want to take into account, which go beyond the principles that right now that it is adhering to those. The other aspect that we would imagine perhaps going forward is that it could lead to, say, a sovereign green masala issuance, where you actually go offshore, but you issue in your domestic currency. But then you are also actually inviting a larger pool of investors to invest into your sovereign bond.
Coming to Mr. Manish, you did mention about, the key role the carbon markets can play. So what kind of domestic growth you see in India? And, India also being one of the third largest emitter. And, if you could also brief us about the challenges for the MSME sector.
MSME sectors, as we all know that they are very much vulnerable in reference to getting the finance. And since in near future, because during the starting phase of a domestic emission trading scheme, obviously the large emitters would get covered, but slowly mid-level sector, low-level sector in a specific industrial sector, MSMEs are also going to get covered. So it is very, very much important to let them know by which year they are going to get included into the emission reduction targets. If they are going to get included, what would be the low carbon pathway for them to achieve those specific goals, and what kind of support in the form of education or knowledge, or in the form of technology, in the form of further finance support. It is very, very much important that such kind of budgetary options should be pre-planned, not only during this year, but in coming few years, all such kind of provisions should be there.
Coming to Dr. Chaturvedi, you mentioned the speed and scale part of it, and keeping in mind the global economic scenario, there have been, kind of demands to bring down the interest rate on lending to the renewable energy sector. So how do you see, balancing happening in the budget?
Well, let me say balancing is always a tough act. So there is no kind of perfect remedy for that. But having said that, let me say budget is always, it's not just about the numbers, right? I mean, budget is also about sending a message. And what is, I think, great, what we have seen in the last 4 or 5 years, the government is giving a consistent message through budget. The budget is only one of the instruments. There are other instruments. The budget is also, well, you could say many things, right? But budget is where you actually put money on the table. So it's an extremely powerful message if it comes to the budget, right? So what we have seen is the government has consistently been focusing on the green or decarbonization agenda itself. And budget, through budget, it has demonstrated it. So I think that point needs to be mentioned because it's a consistent message. And what the budget is simply saying and has been saying, and I'm very, very sure that even the new budget and the forthcoming budgets will also continue the same thing in a very consistent fashion. They're simply saying, well, this is the public money, right? This is the public money we are allocating. And essentially, public money is the fulcrum around which private money will pool. Budget is a great opportunity to ensure that the policy framework is in that place where it actually guides markets toward delivering that sort of desirable outcome, which in this particular case is decarbonization or a low carbon economy, right? And that is why this public money that the budget puts on the table, whether it puts for strategic technologies or pushing those like hydrogen, whether it puts those for enhancing speed and scale of already proven technologies, well, it is about ensuring that there is a consistent message and the money that is put on the table is able to pool in a lot of private money. So that's how. So that is a larger balancing act. It is much more important to be consistent and have a very certain and predictable framework to the market. That is where the balancing act should focus on, rather than just balancing the numbers part of the larger budget equation, right? Now, yeah, having said that, just another point I want to add, because carbon markets is a very, very important kind of discussion. Manish just talked about it. Now, in the carbon markets, discourse, we should differentiate between large point sources and small point sources, right? So the emission trading scheme that the government of India is talking about is going to be about large point sources, because it's practically impossible to monitor like a million small enterprises. Practically impossible, right? So even in our earlier, the PAT scheme, perform, achieve, and trade scheme, the number of units that we have are only large point sources, because you can effectively monitor large point sources. You can't do that for small enterprises, right? So even the domestic emission trading scheme, it will have these large point sources and under its purview. That is very, very clear. But the question is, what happens to small point sources, right? And that is where the notion of complementary policies comes in, right? The complementary policies are absolutely important. And that's why the budget could or should have a provision. So this carbon market is essentially an administrative architecture. So how do you operationalize the carbon market? It is all about creating the administrative architecture, right? Now, since fortunately we already had the PAT scheme, a lot of the administrative architecture is already in place, right? But of course, it has to be strengthened, it has to be expanded, many of those things. So investment will be, now this is public investment, right? Which will be required to create that kind of very robust administrative architecture for implementing carbon markets, right? So that kind of money should be there in the budget to provide for the establishment of a carbon market, right? So that will be there. The second point becomes that, okay, what do you do with all these small enterprises, right? Because they are not going to be covered by carbon markets. So that is where you could have incentives for MSME sector for, let's say, energy efficiency enhancement, right? So in the overall decarbonization paradigm, the notion of complementary policies is very important, and it is a carbon market is going to be one very important instrument to deliver on the decarbonization agenda. There also have to be a suite of complementary policies that look at other sectors that are not going to be covered by the carbon market, but they also are aligned very well with the larger decarbonization agenda, because otherwise there could be very interesting leakage effects. Research has shown us very clearly. For example, you have a carbon tax on a large steel enterprise, right? Heavy carbon tax. That means the steel become more expensive, right? Because of that. And there is a small enterprise, or there is a bunch of small enterprises which actually don't have a carbon price on them. So now there's a competitiveness effects of these instruments, right? So that is why it has to be ensured that there's no leakage that happens in the process, and we don't change the competitive dynamics of the industry, because then the industry will not be happy at all, right? We have to ensure through complementary policies, through these smart interventions, as a part of the budget, to ensure that everybody is facing some price not a price that kind of gives any negative economic shock to the market. That's also very important criteria and principle. No economic shocks can be acceptable at this point of time, right? So that's also very, very important. Those kinds of things or principles have to be kept in mind when the budget is thinking about these incentives for all the big one and the small enterprises.
Thank you. So kind of wrap up rounds or request, all the three speakers, if like in 1 minute, they could just wrap up of, what would be their, kind of expectation, final expectations. So starting with Manish,
Yeah, so final expectations from the budget is in reference to removing the tax from the income from the sale of carbon credits, either at the national level or at the international level. And then removing the GST and further taxes which are there related to the implementation of community-based projects or nature-based solution activities. Because of this such kind of activities, we would be able to put more and more projects within India, and would be able to export those credits to the international voluntary carbon markets. Further expectations are putting budget over creating education and promotion to the SMEs and the other obligated entities at the national level because of the domestic emission trading scheme, or because of the international compliance market through Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, or through CBAM. So all such provisions should be there in place, which will enable Indian investors or obligated entities to remain competitive at the international front.
Great. Coming to you, Vaibhav, in a nutshell.
Well, I think in a nutshell, whenever I look at budgets, I just see what is the big message that is coming out for our sector, right? Yeah. So maintaining consistency of message across budgets is absolutely important. Till now, the government has been very successful, at least for the green sector, in doing so. So I do hope it continues with that message, consistent message for the markets. And the second thing, as I talked about, thinking separately about strategic technologies versus technologies where you need to just, now you are at the stage where you could push for speed and scale, right? So thinking on both of these in a structured way should be very important for this particular budget.
Over to you, Neha.
Yes, I think the couple of points that I have in my mind is, of course, picking up from what Vaibhav has said, consistency and clarity of policy signal is an extremely important aspect. And budget in that sense is that kind of document that gives you a direction that, yes, we are moving in that direction, clearly supported by also the outlays. I would say that while mitigation targets will be important, the last budget also had some announcements on adaptation and resilience in the direction of having more sustainable practices in agriculture. I think some sectoral outlays in that direction would be extremely important, where private finance is slightly slow to come and government can actually clearly mark out that it is looking at those practices and that those adaptation and resilience aspects to be integrated in especially in agriculture sector. So I would really hope that agriculture sector sustainability in agriculture sector is sort of better supported by the budget. The other aspect would be that definitely the demand for green investment comes right now from foreign investors. How do we actually unlock this investor demand domestically is a challenge, is a point of action for Indian policymakers. And there are no dedicated pools for green investment in India, which can create the market differentiation or demand. So whether the budget actually takes upon itself that there are mandatory carve-outs, perhaps from pension funds or insurance funds, which actually start creating the demand for green investment domestically, that would be important. And again, just to touch back upon the point of national development banks at the state level DFIs, are they well capitalized and repurposed to actually integrate sustainability and hence play the role of, crowding in private capital is going to be important. I think NAFIT is now operational. It is going to raise around 15,000 crores in the next couple of months. The fact that it is different from other development banks that we have is that it definitely has an ESG sectoral lens of lending as well. So how do they, and so its capitalization is very important, right? So 20,000 crores that the budget had announced for NAFIT capitalization enables it to actually mobilize nearly 4 lakh crores. So again, going back to what the public finance can do in terms of, crowding in private capital will be very important. So yes, sectoral policies, which are sort of vertical policies within each sector, whether that's agriculture, EVs, renewables, but the horizontal policy clarity, which pertains to financial policy and regulation, is also equally important. And within that, you would have things like taxonomy, disclosures, etc., or which can be taken outside the budget announcements. But it is something that the green finance market is actually looking at, and hopefully budget will show us the direction that we are going into in that regard also.
Great. So I hope that budget, continue to have a consistency and clarity to push for the green sector. So we finally come to the end of the ET India Budget Climate Action Edition. And I would really like to thank our viewers and all the 3 of our panelists for joining us. It was really great to have you. Thank you so much.